Hey, good morning, everybody, or I'm sure for some of you, good afternoon, and welcome to Mr. Rose's House of COVID. Going to take a few minutes here today as part of a lecture to kind of help make sense out of what's taking place in the United States between the Abraham Lincoln's election and his actual inauguration. So first thing, again, really looking forward to hopefully next week being back in person with everybody, and I know that Mr. Dario feels the same way. So this week we've had you taking a look at a number of events taking place in the 1850s that seemed to move the United States closer to civil war. From kind of the rise of abolitionists like Harriet Beecher Stowe in the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, to the work of radical John Brown traveling to Kansas, killing people, trying to start a slave rebellion that ultimately failed in Virginia. And you've also looked at laws that had the effect of expanding the territory in which slavery was legal, from Kansas-Nebraska Act to the Dred Scott decision made by the Supreme Court in 1857. And all of this is to try to give you guys the ability to think about this question about, was the Civil War in fact inevitable? And if it was inevitable, at what point did it become inevitable? What was the breaking point beyond which we could not go back anymore? So we're going to continue trying to make sense out of that. And so some of what we're going to do here in the next 10 minutes is to go back over the last couple of days, and we're going to add in some new information as well. And you definitely want to stick around to the end to help you understand what you're going to be doing for the rest of your time today. So Abraham Lincoln's election was definitely the trigger for secession. In fact, there were 7 of the states, the Deep South states, the ones you see in the dark gray, that they seceded even before Lincoln actually became president. So it wasn't like he had done something that caused them to secede. Just his very victory in the election alone was enough to convince them to try to leave the United States. Some of the work you're going to do later today will get into maybe why they reacted the way that they did. Great pause there. So you had 7 states leave before he even became president. Now, if you would note, looking at this map, not all of the states that allowed slavery seceded immediately. And in fact, some of those states that allowed slavery would never secede at all. These next 4 states, Arkansas, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Virginia, they wouldn't secede until after Fort Sumter. This was the attack by South Carolina on a federal fort just off the coast of South Carolina, after which Lincoln, who is now president by this point in time, he asked for aid to help end the rebellion in the seceding states. And those 4 states, rather than aiding the United States in ending the rebellion, they joined in the rebellion. But once again, you still had other states that allowed slavery that never left the Union, although that sentiment was not unanimous in those states, and there was violence within those states all throughout the Civil War. So those states that remained as part of the Union, we call those the border states. One thing I'd like you to take a quick note of here, you should have seen this map earlier in the week. This is the map of the 1860 election. And what you'll see is that the map of secession looks strikingly similar to the map of the 1860 election. We had these border states that didn't vote for Lincoln, the Republican, or for Breckinridge, kind of the fire-eating Democrat, but they voted for John Bell, whose position on the election was, again, if you vote for Lincoln, you're going to end up having secession and a civil war. So maybe Bell was right. Yeah, we'll have to keep moving on there. So yesterday you were working in class looking at the declaration of causes by several different of the states that seceded from the Union. And there's long been this big discussion in history of really what was the Civil War all about. And I'll say that growing up, going to high school, what I was taught was this was all about this abstract concept of states' rights. And again, I know you've seen that already in a couple of readings. The question of what exactly were those rights, however, seems to have a much simpler answer. I've also heard other people suggest that the Civil War was in fact about tariffs. This is why we look at primary sources. Rather than you or I hypothesizing and theorizing what it's about, I thought, let's just look at what the states themselves actually had to say. And here's what I hope your big takeaways were from looking at those documents yesterday, is that all of the orders of secession emphasized issues surrounding slavery. That was the issue. Now, within that, different states emphasized different aspects of it. A number of you noted that there was a lot of discussion about the fugitive slave law and northern resistance to the fugitive slave law. Some of you noted that there seemed to be this belief, I think this was in the Georgia document, that somehow John Brown was in a way like sent by Northerners to kind of destroy slavery where it existed and destroy the Southern way of life. Even though most Northerners really didn't approve of what John Brown did, there was still that sense from some parts of the Southern United States. Some of you also noted that it was merely the election of the Republican Party, who was really the first major party that had an anti-slavery position. But again, what you're gonna work on today, some of you, is understanding that again, there's more than one anti-slavery position. But their election alone, that was enough to convince some states to leave the Union. The other document that you looked at was a speech made by the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. And in this, he explained what the Confederacy was about at its root, at its foundation. And he began by explaining that, in his view, as Vice President of the Confederacy, our Declaration of Independence was wrong. This idea that all men were endowed with inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, he believed that was wrong. And in fact, what he said the entire foundation, the cornerstone of the Confederacy was white supremacy. And the defense of slavery. He kind of didn't hide it. He said, of course this is what this is about. So I don't know how many of you pay attention to the news, but over the last number of years, and really much longer than that, there's been a lot of discussion over what is the meaning of the Confederate flag. And again, with all symbols, different people are going to ascribe different meanings to them. But certainly one of the meanings of the Confederate flag was support for a government that supported white supremacy, that supported slavery. Just a few weeks ago, Mississippi became the last of these states to remove any aspects of the Confederate battle flag from their actual state flag. So when you see discussions about the Confederate flag and what it means, again, it's going to mean a lot of different things to a lot of people, but one of the things that absolutely meant was support for the Confederate governments and its foundations of white supremacy, as we saw in Alexander Stephens' speech. So, after secession, the question that we have to wrestle with now is, did secession necessarily have to mean war? There were a number of people at the time who absolutely didn't think that war was still going to happen. And there were great efforts to try to reach some kind of compromise to make that happen. The most notable of the compromises, it was called the Crittenden Compromise, named after one of the people who pushed for it. And he suggested, I think his name is James Crittenden, he suggested that the U.S. Constitution be changed to provide for absolute guarantees for slavery in the states. It would have extended that Missouri Compromise line, that 3630, all the way out to the Pacific coast, and underneath that slavery would be allowed, and to the north of that slavery would be disallowed, and that rather than trying to force Northerners to participate in bringing escaped slaves back into slavery, then said Congress would just pay slave owners whose enslaved people had run away. Lincoln rejected this idea, and he wasn't the only one. But for him, his rejection was based on the idea that he had campaigned on this idea of not allowing slavery to expand. That was the whole idea. That's why he was elected. And so this Crittenden Compromise would have allowed for the expansion of slavery to the West. And so he felt like he really couldn't run a campaign, be elected on the basis of what he said he was going to do, and before he even becomes president, turn around and go back against that. So he rejected that compromise, as did others. But again, I think the important thing here is there were still people who thought that the Civil War wasn't necessarily going to happen. There's another question that we have to wrestle with, and that's why not just let those southern states secede? Why not just let them become their own country? And to answer that, we're going to take a look at what Lincoln's position was as part of his first inaugural address when he was finally made president in March of 1861. I'd very, very quickly like you to notice in this first paragraph, for his part, Lincoln, it was clear to him what secession was all about. There was no grand illusion to him what this was about, so I'm going to do a very quick reading from that. One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. In other words, Lincoln understood for any way everybody wanted to look at it, any discussion, any debate eventually came down to slavery. But now this question of why not just let the southern states go? And again, we're going to look at what he said in 1861. Plainly, the idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. Anarchy is the rejection of law. To continue, he had this idea, or his idea was, if we have what we call a Republican form of government, where we hold elections, there's going to be a winner and a loser, and the winner has the ability to pass laws, and those majorities and the laws that they pass are going to be restrained by the rights written in the Constitution. From Lincoln's perspective, if an election is held and the losing side simply rejects the election, the results of the election, because they don't like the outcome, essentially they're rejecting law. They're rejecting the entire way that our system is supposed to work. And again, it's not like he had come into office and passed any laws. He still wasn't even president yet. So essentially his view was, if they let these states simply take their ball and go home because they don't like the results of an election, that means that any state, anybody, anytime they don't like the results of any contest, they can simply leave the Union. They can ignore law itself. So Lincoln, for his part, he thought he was standing up not just for the United States, but the very idea of a Republican form of government. We come together, we hold elections. Some people are going to be happy and some are going to be unhappy with it. But since nobody's rights had actually been violated at this point in time, there was no legitimate cause for the breakup of the Union. So I'm going to send you loose here in a moment. Don't turn off yet. Your assignment for today, you're going to be doing one of 3 different kind of secondary source readings that all deal with some aspect of development of the 1850s. And none of these cover like a specific event. Instead, they talk about something that takes place over a longer span of time. The reading that you have will be based upon the order, or based upon the last name, so check Google Classroom for instructions. And again, as you read, this is all still try to build up information that you have to try to answer this question about, was the Civil War inevitable? Oh, for a bonus point, at the end of your question, simply type the word union, U-N-I-O-N, in capital letters, and then we'll throw you an extra bonus point. Have a good day, and we'll see you tomorrow.